Hi, I'm Jake, a park ranger here in the Blind Eternities. See, the beauty of this multiverse is everything that it has to offer. You see, we as planeswalkers have the ability to explore every last inch of it, collecting everything that connects with us, and assembling it into a tapestry of unique experiences that we can bring to duels with other planeswalkers. But every year, I'm seeing more and more complaints about one particular part of one particular plane. That is pre-mending Dominaria, and a section of campgrounds that have been walled off, limited, a sort of timeshare situation. They are reserved. You know, I could get you a list. But that reserved list has caused so many headaches. So I think we need to discuss it. Today, we're talking about the reserve list. So when we talk about the reserve list, I think we have to start with a little bit of history. What is it and why does it exist? The what is pretty simple. The reserve list is a selection of cards from early in Magic's history that cannot be reprinted. There's a policy in place that prevents those cards from being printed again. It's been broken a few times, but moreover, Wizards of the Coast has decided that that is now locked in place. In the first few years of the reserve list, you saw cards being added and removed from it, and it was sort of a living document of cards that were memorialized from being reprinted into modern Magic product. But now, that has pretty much stopped, and no new cards have been added to the reserve list in decades. But the more complicated question is, why does the reserve list exist? And I think the reserve list existed, or was instituted, for two main reasons. The first you probably already know, and that is financial reasons. You see, with the reserve list, the supply of these cards remains fixed, which means as people buy into them as a collector's product, the value of those cards will generally increase, and that's what we've seen. Over time, the value of these reserve list cards has gone up. But the second reason, I think, doesn't get talked about a lot. And the second reason is that these cards were special. They were extremely powerful. They were from certain standard sets that had specific themes. And by putting them on the reserve list, it kind of retires them from that standard rotation. These cards can no longer be brought back into the tournament format. And that exclusion works on a number of levels. See, because when you have these cards excluded from standard, it forces the design space to become broader, to use those same mechanics in different ways, so it's not just strictly power creeping, because that would break some of the terms of the reserve list. Now obviously there are weak cards on the reserve list, and there are somewhat strictly better versions of those cards that exist off the reserve list. But I think there's another implication of this when it comes to reprints and new cards being released. Since these cards were walled out of standard, there wasn't really a good place to use them. They became collector's pieces. And that was true up until very recently. I distinctly remember sitting at a card show years back, probably 2002, 2003, and someone came up and asked me if I would be interested in buying their green-black deck. Because I was looking for some green-black cards. And they had an entire deck, 60 cards, that they wanted to sell. And it was $100. It had a playset of Pernicious Deed, it had a playset of Spirit Mongers, and it had a playset of Bayou. Now, I wanted the Pernicious Deeds and I wanted the Spirit Mongers because those were still used and extended, and they were still playable and generally accepted at the table in casual Magic. But Bayous are a little bit older, a little bit more powerful, and not really legal in any of the tournaments that I was going to. So I wasn't interested in buying them. And if you were to look at the price of Bayou during that time period, pretty much all dual lands were going from $15 to $20. I think Bayou was like $16 to $17 at the time, because there was no real place to use it. Now, obviously everyone knows the sort of format creep that Magic has gone through since then, and how broadly these cards are used in Canadian Highlander and EDH and Tiny Leaders and all of these other formats. People have become hungrier for those reserve list cards. But there was a time that the reserve list removed them from competitive play, almost entirely. And because they were on the reserve list, you could rest assured that they were not coming back into competitive play. The only people interested in them were the people that played Vintage, and even then, good luck finding a paper Vintage tournament. So because these cards were on the reserve list, they became collector's pieces. And they stopped being game pieces. But now we've reached a point where those cards have become game pieces again. We see them in Commander, we see them in Cube, we see them in Canadian Highlander. We need those reserve list cards. And now they can't be reprinted. So the question becomes, what's the solution? How do we increase the supply of a card that explicitly has its supply capped? And I think Wizards of the Coast is trying a few different angles with which they can reprint cards from the reserve list in new forms. So let's talk about a few of the times that Wizards of the Coast has tried to go around the reserve list. The first, I think, is with the Judge promos that they put out. They took a selection of cards from the reserve list and released them as Judge promos. This upset a lot of people because the Judge promos had special borders. They were foil. They were unique. They had different art. And so in some cases, those Judge foil versions of the cards actually command a higher price than the original. So people that were holding onto those initial collector's items didn't get to experience that jump in price that card generated. Alternatively, Magic has reprinted some of the reserve list cards in specialty product. From the Vault Relics had a variety of cards in it, and so did the Dual Decks Invasion vs. Phyrexia. It had a Phyrexian Negator as one of the cover creatures on the box. And they also impacted the price of some of those cards. What we saw is that if the card is not mechanically powerful for current Magic, reprinting it causes the cost to fall. All you have to do is look at the cost of Berserk, a card not on the reserve list, but one that hadn't been printed in over 20 years. When it showed up in Conspiracy, the cost of the original card dropped by about half, because the card wasn't sought after for its mechanical implications. It was just rare. And if you increase the supply, the cost is going to fall, because mechanically the card wasn't doing anything interesting. I think with a lot of the reserve list cards, we'd see a similar situation, where because the card is not mechanically powerful, if it was reprinted, the value would fall through the floor. And even on the cards that are mechanically powerful, I'm looking at the dual lands and some of those that have a very, very high degree of interest from people who want to buy it. If they were reprinted at substantial quantities, I think the cost of those original cards would drop a lot. And so Wizards is very careful about how they reprint those reserve list cards. But we've seen a couple different options recently that they've been exploring, nibbling around the edges of the reserve list, trying to find a way to put some of these cards into players' hands. When we see new formats like Commander and Cube and Canlander take off, and people once again have an interest in some of these old reserve list cards, people are looking for any way to get their hands on a card that either has the text and image of the card that they're after, regardless of border or shape or condition, then they care about having it be a real original copy of the card. We've also seen a corresponding ballooning of the proxy market for people making their own copies of these cards, because there's no way to get your hands on an original. And so Wizards has tried to break into this a bit. Their first foray into making a new generation of these reserve list cards was the 30th anniversary set that they released, where they reprinted a wide variety of cards from Alpha, very sought after cards, in booster packs that you can open, with the caveat that the back of the card would not be the standard Magic card back. That they would, for all intents and purposes, be proxies. And the community was thrilled, because that sounds amazing. but when they announced the cost of the cards, each pack was going to be $250. And that doesn't solve the main problem that the reserve list causes. Again, the reserve list helps those that are very old or very wealthy. And so, at that price, it doesn't fix many things. And a lot of the cards from that 30th anniversary set have gone right back up there in value. Not to the cost of the originals, but well beyond the reach of anybody who just wants to casually play at the tabletop. So now, Wizards, I think, is exploring a couple of other paths. And we've seen this most recently in Mystery Booster 2 boxes. We've seen a couple different approaches that Wizards of the Coast has taken that I think open up new avenues for reprinting some of these old reserve list cards. So first off, we have the playtest cards. These are cards that look like they have playtest stickers put on it with unique abilities, kind of a future sight style design space for Magic. And in these Mystery Booster sets, they've gone almost silver border with the mechanics that they introduce. But they've also created a couple cards that very easily could fit into any regular Magic set. And in the most recent set, we see Magus of the Chains. Now, Chains of Mephistopheles is a famously complex card, but it's on the reserve list, and it's quite expensive. So this Magus of the Chains has the exact same ability, but is also a 2/2 creature. Same mana cost, same rules box exactly, with the difference that you have to babysit a creature in play instead of it just being an enchantment. Now this causes other complications, but it does make it really easy to just take a Sharpie and fix it a little bit, so that you have a playable copy with a real Magic the Gathering card back of Chains of Mephistopheles. A card that you could easily slot into any of your CEDH decks. It's made on the same cardstock, it's got the same card back. It's really easy to slot that in as an alternative for a real Chains. And it has the rules text right on the card. You're not having to write all of that in yourself, or deal with going to a printer and trying to get something that feels like a Magic card in a sleeve. I think that's a good option, and I think they could go that direction. But there's another that's a little more direct. See, in one of the recent Magic sets, we see Tarmogoyf tokens. And if you can take a Tarmogoyf, a famously sought-after card, and turn that into a token, well, there's not really any reason why you couldn't take any other extremely sought-after Magic card and turn that into a token. Especially if there happens to be a real Magic card that produces those tokens. You see, in the past we had Garth One-Eye that could tap to put a Black Lotus token into play. But now we have Alpha of the Oracle, which conjures cards, not an ability that exists in regular Magic, but there's nothing stopping them from making conjured cards as tokens, with the only real requirement being that they'd have to have a real Magic the Gathering back and the rules text for the card that is conjured, so you can shuffle it into your deck. But if you're doing that, if you have a card with a real Magic the Gathering back and a face that says Black Lotus and has all of the rules texts for Black Lotus, well, you've essentially reprinted Black Lotus. So even if it says token, I'm not sure how that fits into the reserve list. I suspect they can't do that. But if they make enough cards that are making those tokens, making Black Lotuses or Time Walks, or with Duskmourn, they've introduced the possibility of making token lands. This is new. They haven't made token lands in the past. So we're only a couple steps away from making token dual lands. And including those in the set. Make them silver bordered. Give them a glow-in-the-dark treatment. Something really weird. Who cares? As long as people can get cards on real Magic cardstock that have the mechanical effect they're looking for those cards that are locked behind the reserve lists, I think it would make a lot of people happy. And I don't think it would affect the price of those original game pieces. So I'm really hoping that this represents a turning point for Wizards of the Coast. A new way to introduce some of these older cards in a way that doesn't really impact the value of the originals. At this point, Magic is such a big game with so many people interested, there's just not enough supply to support them. And so Magic needs a way of printing more of those old cards. And even if they're not legal in real tournaments, I think the community is okay with that. Because if Wizards continues to make more Garth One-Eyes and Alpha of the Oracles that put into play Black Lotus tokens, without actually having an official Black Lotus token, I think people are just going to make their own. And for a card like Chains of Mephistopheles, it's a complicated card. It definitely can't be reprinted in any modern set. And it doesn't make sense to make that a token. For complexity reasons, or just readability reasons. I think cards like Magus of the Chains, cards like that can be easily co-opted for a real copy of the card, are the next best thing. Because if Wizards doesn't go that direction, if they continue to refuse to reprint some of these classic cards, I think people are just gonna make their own. And while that's okay from a gameplay perspective, from a health of the game and a continuation of Wizards of the Coast producing support for some of these other formats, well, if people are just using a printer, there's no reason for Wizards to support it at all. We'll see what happens, but it definitely looks like we're making forward progress for the way that we handle the reserve list, and I'm really hopeful that Wizards finds a good way of managing that moving forwards.